pretty good. Let's see. Yeah, usually around here, have the Green Mountain 5. It looks like we're doing pretty good here, though. Nice, nice. Get to these points, get in your Zen moment, and then you can relax. Tyrone, who was with you there. Lakes much more here. Yeah, and I hope, you know, one of the things that was on the tables, it said 7, so I hope we didn't lose anybody by virtue of that. We changed all of them. I caught that at lunch. Where on the table, there were some of the flyers. There were, everywhere else it was 6:30, and on those it said 7, and we caught it at lunch. So I hope that didn't throw anybody off. I mean, we certainly pumped enough stuff out there by way of classes. Campus emails and everything else. But drifters, just about got it. A few more there. Well, should we give it a go, you think? That's So we have 250 grad students spread all over the U.S. and Canada, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and so they're getting this by way of live streaming. So, and anybody else who picks it up. Think we ought to give it a go? Alrighty, super. Good evening, everybody. So, welcome. My name is Philip Ackerman Leist. I am the director of the GMC Farm and Food Project and the director of the Masters in Sustainable Food Systems here at Green Mountain College. And it really gives me great pleasure to be here with you tonight and have the honor, and it truly is an honor and privilege to be able to introduce Michael Twitty. As we start to dive into that, what I'd like to first do is recognize some of the folks who have helped us pull this together. And so would like to thank the ELA program and the Voices of Community folks who have helped fund this, along with the College Programming Board. And I think that really speaks in many ways to Green Mountain College and the power of what goes on here, that we have the College Programming Board and our environmental liberal arts faculty and curriculum and students also supporting what we're doing. So we're very, very fortunate. And also want to make sure to give a shout out to not only Michael, but also the supporting staff that has happened today, folks who've been up, running around. They were up late last night and then running around today trying to make sure that we had the meal all prepared. So Chef Dave, Chef Tom, also we had Keith, Bella, Noah, many other folks who showed up and even cut up over 200 pounds of sweet potatoes, as well as cooking the pork that started at 7 a.m. So let's give a shout out to those folks. And I also have to ask, what do you think of Michael's cooking? It really is a personal privilege to be here and introduce Michael, and in part because that food really represents so much of my own background, having grown up in North Carolina. But not only the food, but also I think what Michael is doing here tonight in talking about food as community, about the root in many ways of the notion of companion, compane, actually with whom we break bread together. Also to talk about how food defines stereotypes, and how food can break down stereotypes as well and bring people together. I actually grew up in a small town in North Carolina, in which I'm embarrassed to say, but truth is, above the town city limit sign, there was a sign there, the billboard above the tiny little sign, said, "The Ku Klux Klan welcomes you to Smithfield, North Carolina, where we oppose integration, communism, and Judaism." And that was the environment that I grew up in. It was very intense. The stuff that Michael is talking about is very real. I've certainly seen that. I should also tell you the small North Carolina town where I went to college, the first wedding that was the first integrated wedding that ever happened in that community was with the woman who owned the soul food restaurant downtown. The little, folks called it the hole in the wall. It was where we all went to eat. So things can be ugly, but they can also be really wonderful, and food can be that kind of medium of conversation and also really help bring us together as we're thinking about things. So Michael Twitty, as I think you know, is really extraordinary. He's a noted culinary and cultural historian. He created Afroculinaria, which I encourage you to check out. It was the first blog devoted to African American historic foodways and their legacy. He appeared on Bizarre Foods America with Andrew Zimmerman. He also was on Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates. He's lectured to more than 200 groups, including Yale, Oxford, and Carnegie Mellon universities, and Colonial Williamsburg. He's spoken around the world from Copenhagen to London to Jerusalem on culinary justice, which is really the theme in so many ways of this evening, culinary justice and the African American impact on Southern foodways. HarperCollins will release Michael's first major book in 2016, The Cooking Gene, and it traces his ancestry through food and he was also recently named one of 50 people most influential in the South and one of 5 of the most famous chef activists in the United States. And so I wanted to make sure that as Michael steps up here, and kosher soul is his handle, and so when you're trying to change food systems, it's always about a carrot and a stick, but in Michael's case, I think it's a carrot and we'll trade him the carrot for his shtick. So. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. So I want to not be too afraid of my own voice in a microphone. That's always a thing, right? It's, how do I put this? Sometimes you get invited to really big places with a lot of different agendas. And sometimes you get invited to small places with huge hearts. And Green Mountain College is the latter. I have only felt welcome, I've only felt encouraged, and I have only felt a sense of camaraderie and friendship here. And coming all the way to Vermont for the first time, that is something that I definitely needed. When a couple of weeks ago, I always say a couple of weeks ago, and I really mean a long time ago, you know, when you're in living history, that works that way. 200 years is like 2 minutes. I was in Jerusalem, and I had the occasion to listen and see Sarah Silverman talk. And she was really angry at the people in her audience who were using social media because she really wanted them to be in the moment. And while I love Sarah Silverman, you are welcome to tweet anything you want. That's my bread and butter, so go ahead. Social media me, tweet me, Instagram me, Facebook, whatever you want to do. That's perfectly fine with me. I don't find it rude at all. When you go to food conferences, you're expected to do this the whole time. So no offense taken. So it's always a conundrum where to start. So I assume you like the food. That was good? All right. So that's awesome. It's not always that I have an audience that has eaten the food that I have. The food that I cook is my flag. It's my banner. It's my identity. It's my passport. So there is a proverb in West Africa that I want you all to kind of like drill in. And it says, when you sit down and eat with someone, you know that person. Sit down and eat with me and you will know me. Sit down and eat with someone and you will know them. And so I hope that the introduction to me came through whatever you thought of the Carolina mustard sauce and whatever you thought of the braised greens. And I just thank Dave and Tom and all of the students and Philip for just making all that happen. It was so easy and so breezy and so wonderful, and I didn't have to cook for a ton of people all by myself, which was fantastic. So now that I've said all of that, I just want to jump into this. First, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a slideshow through my work, but I want to talk first and foremost and set this up so I don't forget to talk about it, about what I mean by culinary justice. So, food justice has become a major offshoot component idea of social justice. And there are other injustices, aren't there? There's environmental justice, there's food justice, and I'm talking about culinary justice. And 2 years ago, a young woman said to me, who's also African American, a little bit older, food activist, said to me, You know, it's sort of elitist for you to talk about culinary justice when we don't have food justice. And I said, hold it right there, baby. Here's the first thing. If all I have on my table is rice and beans, and somebody jacks my rice and beans and claims it and appropriates it, then I need my culinary justice back. So it's that sense of, as I've been known to say, when you are oppressed, how you survive your oppression is your greatest form of capital. That is your goal. That is your treasure. And when oftentimes when you are a second-class citizen, in more ways than one, you don't always value and appreciate those systems of survival that your ancestors gave you. And so when I was growing up, ladies and gentlemen, I hated soul food. When I was a little boy, I hated soul food. In other words, I hated my soul. I didn't like being black. I didn't like being African American. I thought I was ugly. I thought I was stupid. I thought that my culture was beneath white people. And that's something that I more freely admit, and that will show you how far I've come. My mother used to say to me, listen to me, I tell you stories about how you used to act when you were a little kid because I want you to understand how far you've come. I used to hate her saying that, but now I totally understand. The person you see in these pictures has owned and embraced the fact that I'm a black, gay, Jewish man. I hit the jackpot. And because of that, I can own the fact that when I was a little boy, I just thought it was the grossest stuff with animal bones in it, and it smelled, and it was greasy, and it was all in one pot. And the reality is, we're talking about really earthy, handcrafted food, right? Let's use our buzzwords. It was handcrafted. It was organic because it came from my grandmother's garden, and our dog Brandy was the fertilizer system for that garden. I love Brandy, big St. Bernard. And it was local because it came from the backyard. And what other buzzwords can I use? It was GMO free, yes. And it was vegan until it hit the ham hock. And it was, all that stuff. But you don't think about it that way when you're growing up in it. And so this has been a long journey for me. Every second leading up to this stage is part of that journey. And I don't want to lie to you. I don't want to brand myself as someone who hasn't had a change. Because if I'm up here and I'm here saying to you, oh, I've always been this person, then what do you have to learn from me? That I was born that way, right? I was born with this sense of mission and justice. No, I wasn't. I had to go outside of my bubble. So, being Jewish is a big part of that system as well, because I had to be outside of that bubble and learn about a culture of tikkun olam, to repair the world, a culture of freedom for all means that everybody has to have the same opportunities to thrive and succeed. Gay food. I know that you think gay food is no carbs. You can laugh at that. But it's more than that. It's about how you express yourself, and that someone can show their fierceness and their shadiness through how they cook. It's all there. All those parts of me are one universe holistically, and the same goes to everybody else in this audience. Everything you are goes into your plate. Everything you are goes into the cooking pot when you cook. And so if you understand that and work off of that paradigm, you will understand what I mean. If you eat with me, you know who I am. So, okay, now I'm going to take you on this little journey. Culinary injustice happens when people of any background, it's not a racial thing. I don't believe in race. I believe in ethnicities and phenotypes and genotypes. Those are all proven. I do not believe in races. We're one human race. So let's get that straight from the get-go. there are issues of color, there are issues of identity, there are issues of class. And all of those can fall into culinary justice or injustice. Consider New Englanders the lobster. Is a lobster an expensive food now or a cheap food? What did it start out as? Trash food. So that's an issue of culinary injustice, is it not? That, 300 years ago, people used them to fertilize the potato fields. And now it's a gourmet treat. How do those in power take certain foods, recontextualize them, appropriate them, relabel them, and resell them at market value? Is really how culinary injustice works. How those communities impacted take their traditions back, share them with others in an appropriate and respectful way, and benefit from them in perpetuity is culinary justice. You see the difference? So when we have chefs who market themselves as discovering the African roots of Southern cuisine, and they themselves are not of African descent, never were, never will be. And yet there have been culinary historians and chefs of color who've been working on that for quite some time, and yet the media says, okay, you're so great because you discovered this for those people. In 2013 and 14, what do we make of that? Why is that acceptable? Why is it acceptable to say that in culinary schools we will study every cuisine but African, diaspora, and African homeland, and African influenced? What does it mean when books still say stupid things like, okra is an African word? Okay, let me ask you a question. You ever read in the dictionary that apple was a European word? And how stupid would that sound? Because, the European language is so common, it's like the African language. But it's that kind of sloppy lack of attention to detail, that kind of black-eyed peas, watermelon, and rice, ain't them Negroes so nice kind of stuff that we've gotten so used to. That is pretty much the brush version of the black influence in American food. And it speaks nothing to those ancestors, that they had names. And typically, they were some of the only people on a plantation whose names went down in history. That those people were not just enslaved people, they were entrepreneurs. And when you consider that, all of that history of entrepreneurship, of success, of black caterers who lived before the Civil War ended and who were passing down businesses of renown, who were the best, not the second best, the best. When you forget that all this stuff is not being passed down to the present generation of children of color, they're losing out on a vision of themselves, of success, of empowerment, of growth, of beauty, of strength, of intelligence, of knowledge, of wisdom. We have almost completely lost, ladies and gentlemen, the library of early African American knowledge and wisdom. These people didn't get off the boat and they weren't told everything to do. They were pioneers in their own right. They were black pioneers in their own right. Building, cutting, creating, praying, singing. As I said in England, they took the language of a king and made it poetry in the mouths of slaves. And with that, they created a foodway culture that transcended slavery. We are the only people on earth, Africans in the Americas, who took their enslavement and used it to rock the world. Nobody doesn't groove to our beat. Doesn't matter if you're Brazilian, Jamaican, African American. There's nobody on this planet who's not touched by our influence, as witnessed the holiday we just celebrated. That is a global figure. And I'm proud to say that my people brought him to this earth. So we can get into some more questions of how this works, but let's play grandpa with the slides for a moment. So Henry Louis Gates asked me to be a part of Many Rivers to Cross. And I made for him a late 18th century, early 19th century African-American traditional meal. Most of the time when I cook on the grounds of historic plantations and sites related to slavery. Where I was historic London town near Annapolis. It's not very far from where Alex Haley's ancestor Kunta Kinte arrived, and London town in and of itself was an entrepot for the slave trade. So where we were standing, people actually got off the boat from a 3 to 4 month journey from Africa and were disembarked. So we made this meal for him on the hearth. He did not want the okra. He said he was allergic, which I took to mean he just don't like okra. But it was a grand moment because he used this to illustrate the way we can get in touch with our ancestors. I don't care if you're Italian, Slovak, Thai, Inuit, or what have you. We know precious little about our ancestors, correct? We don't know about their favorite joke or the little song they used to sing or how they like their haircut. We're lucky to have a picture, a birth date, a death date, a marriage date. But we can experience, as we say in Yiddish, through our kishkas, through our intestines, through our guts, where our feelings are, how their tastes, how they lived, how they loved, and that's what they passed down to us, these flavors, these preferences. And it is an incredible way to know from which you come. And that's why I've invested my time in food, because it's one thing to say Black Lives Matter. It's another thing to act like it and mean it, and honor their memory, and honor the people who are coming after you who need a culture and tradition to keep them from falling victim to the same social processes. So none of this is taken lightly. When the minute I began to take food seriously, that was the moment that changed my life. So this gentleman is named Lon Outen. And in 2012, I embarked on a journey called the Southern Discomfort Tour, because I wanted to go to these sites in the South where my ancestors were from before I began to lose more and more memory, and I was getting amnesia about my own identity and my path. And so I was saying things that weren't exactly, contiguous with reality, and I said, I want to go find the dead folks, the living people, and find my family. And what I found out is that family comes in every shape, form, fashion, and color. And you'll see more of that later. But there's this idea in Hebrew of mishpacha, in Yiddish mishpoche, which means your family. And it's not just the people who you are blood related to. It's the people who care about you, who have the same passions, the same interests, the same direction, the same drive. And so this project, I feel like God gave it to me because I was being taught a lesson. That it isn't just the bones in the ground or the blood in the veins. It's the brains and the heart of other people that make them family to you. And so Mr. Outen is a genealogist. He's retired, and he was helping me find my ancestors in South Carolina. My ancestors were spread across the South. They were in over half the states that made up the Confederacy, and there for a very long time. Virginia, the Carolinas, both the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, with some touches of Mississippi and Texas. And I'm talking about white as well as black as well as Native American ancestors. And it was something for this man to say to me, I want you to look at this record, and we're going to take a drive. He took me to a Hunt Club's land. We trespassed. And he said, I'm going to show you the grave of your great-great-grandfather, who was in the militia after the Civil War, and his name was Terrell Mungo. And we know that he had a gun. And we know that he was empowered and as part of this militia after the Civil War. And I know where he's buried because I was told by a woman 20 years ago who's now dead, and I wrote everything down. And I know where he's buried. So we drove there 20 minutes away. We walked 20 minutes into this very scary Southern Hunt Club land. It's South Carolina. They shoot first is usually how it goes. And we're walking until the sun hits these little bits of glass and, other things. And he's like, I don't think we found it. I don't think it's here anymore. And all of a sudden, the gleam of all these last effects. See, that's what they used to do before, people could read and write, especially in the South with African influenced communities. The last doll, your eyeglasses, the last cup you use, the last, anything of value was put with the marker when you died as a memorial to you. Think of it like, the Egyptians in pyramids, leaving people's effects with them. And that's how I found my second great-grandfather's grave, and his wife, too. So it blew me away. It was like, wow, he's buried facing east towards Africa. He's generations removed, but this is still part of the reality, the worldview of these people. And it was one of the most sacred and holy places I've ever been in my life. And it taught me that, a lot of people talk about terroir, right? In terms of food. That soil, that's me. That earth, that's me. I am this. That is my source. And that's the source of so many people of African descent. And unfortunately, when you go to reclaim this history, a good friend of mine, Tanya Dietz, who is the daughter of a well-known American archaeologist, James Clifford Dietz, she said to me, when you're white in the South and they bury you, it's a church site. When you're Native American in the South and you're dead, it's a legally protected site. When you're black and you're in the South and you're dead, it becomes a golf course. And she was real. And so luckily they put the police yellow tape around this site that I could at least one time in my life go visit and pay respect to this man who survived slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction enough to get me here. So I want to shift to another ancestor. This is me in a rice field in South Carolina, probably around 2010 or 11. And rice is coming back as a crop in South Carolina. It is, in fact, a boutique crop. It's Carolina Gold. Carolina Gold will cost you $12 to $14 a bag. It is relatively unaffordable if you are from the local Gullah Geechee community in Charleston and Savannah, who typically do not live in the wealthier parts of Charleston, for whom corner stores are more likely to provide food than actual gardens, farms, and fields. But yet, it was their ancestors, I'm going to shift that there in a minute, who grew this boutique crop, Carolina Gold rice. There's not one single African American grower of Carolina Gold rice en masse. So I want you to let that sink in for a second. Absolutely no control over the food system which 250 years ago made the average successful rice planter the equivalent of a millionaire in 2 growing seasons. You think that New York and Philadelphia and Boston, that's what you learn in history books, right? New York, Philadelphia, Boston, knowledge, wealth, capital. Baby, Charleston, New Orleans, Natchez, Mississippi, Savannah, Georgia, where per capita there was more wealth than New York, Philadelphia, or Boston, because rice, cotton, tobacco, indigo, wheat, corn, rye, hemp made people extremely wealthy. First museum, first bookstore, first library, Charleston, 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 built on the backs of enslaved Africans. And so sometime between 1760-something and 1770-something, one of those enslaved Africans who arrived on a boat from Sierra Leone was my 6th great-grandmother. Thank you, DNA. 100% Mende, one of the prime ethnic groups that grew rice in West Africa, and by the way, the same ethnic group from which Dr. King's father's line came from. And not to mention a famous, almost New Englander named Singbe Pie. You know him from the movie Amistad? He was a Mende man too. So my 6th great-grandmother was a Mende woman who was brought here, probably very young, probably between the ages of, I bet you, 15 to 25. And she was brought here because women from Sierra Leone, Liberia, Senegal, Gambia, who knew how to grow rice were extremely valuable. They are what made people millionaires in 2 growing seasons. So when I was in this field, I had no idea that I was reliving part of my ancestral past. And I was also dodging a lot of snakes and alligators. And I was wearing sandals. But just think about that for a second. So when I told Philip, when I go into the field, you see a lot of like armchair historians on PBS talking about slavery, how bad it was. I actually do this garbage. I know that there are some times when people see me on the road in the South, going through a tobacco field, working in my slave clothes and going, oh my God, I guess the Tea Party did win. I said it. It's even better when I say it in Mississippi and they don't know what to say. I know I'm safe up here in Vermont, but this is gross work. Tobacco, come on now. When your hands get stuck with gum and there's bugs everywhere and more snakes. The snake, you got to make your peace with the snakes, trust me. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. And you know, my family worked tobacco in Virginia from the colonial period to now, still, we end up owning land. One of my ancestors was with his brother at Appomattox and got his emancipation right there as Lee and Grant left the building. He was 15 years old. And I like to think that he and his brother were 2 of the first African Americans to learn the nightmare was over and they were free. And so this year is the 150th anniversary. So you know where I'm going to be in April, standing where my ancestor was when he found out he was free man. And after that, his former slaveholder gave him and his brother land. And part of that land is the land my family still grows tobacco today. Then there's cotton. Black people in the audience, this is what it's like. Look how low it is. Look how backbreaking it is. And I want you to think about the fact that at the eve of the Civil War, 2/3 of all African Americans were trapped in the cotton jail. And this plant set the tone for how a lot of our health problems, a lot of our dietary issues, because we lived on a diet of the 3 M's, meat, meal, and molasses. And that was it. Salt, fat, sugar for energy, and that's it, and empty carbohydrates. This is where it all started. What you eat can affect your DNA. Hypertension, diabetes, all that stuff that I face, we face, started in those fields. Malnutrition. So this is something I do as often as I can, picking 300 some pounds of cotton. It is a 16 to 18 hour process, and it is hard, and it will make you cry. And your hands will get cut, and you will sweat. And all you can see is you're blinded by this blank, empty whiteness. You can't see a single leaf or a stem. It's just endless. No green, it's endless. And you understand, you know, music. You understand that whole blues thing, right? The whole spiritual, the whole thing about, you know, field hollers. Let me give you a little hint. You know how you learned in school that garbage about they sang songs like Go Down Moses in the Cotton Field? Complete myth. You can't pick no cotton to go down Moses. I tried. Go down Moses, this is so slow they gonna whoop my... I turned on some Alan Lomax recordings from like Texas where they were in the prison and the chain gang working. I started picking some cotton then because there was some syncopation. You know, it wasn't just, oh Lord, it's hard to be black. It was more like, and so I had a beat and I started picking a lot faster and I understood because I was in their footsteps. But at the end of the day, I realized I could go home. They couldn't. I can go back to whatever reality TV show, whatever cable news program I wanted to go back to, put my feet up, they could not. And so I'm very aware that while I pat myself on the back for being one of the few cultural historians of slavery who actually does this, I still remind myself I'm a very privileged 21st century Negro. And I don't have any reason to complain because the debt was paid for me in those fields every day. That's my granddaddy. My granddaddy's 96. He took me to the cotton gin he used to take his cotton to. And you know what's really beautiful to hear? When your grandfather says to you, after showing you the cotton gin he used to take his cotton to, you know, 1930 something, I made a cotton bale after my daddy died. My grandfather was basically an orphan, took care of his brothers and sisters, raised a bale of cotton almost all by himself, sold the bale of cotton, bought himself a train ticket, a new suit, and a picture of himself in the suit. He went to D.C., went to the job office in his overalls and straw hat, still had the red clay on his shoes, and the lady said to my grandfather, "Mr. Twitty, you're a very nice young man, but I don't think I can give you a job looking like that." At which point my grandfather presented a beautiful picture of him in a fedora, and she said, "Mr. Twitty, come back tomorrow, I'll have you a job." And my grandfather said to me, "I'm so glad I did what I did so that you could have the opportunity to do what you want to do in life. I didn't do it for me, I did it for my children and my grandchildren, and now my grandfather has lived to see his great-great-grandchildren." And when he said that, I couldn't, it was like I had to go off somewhere, you know, and let my tears be part of the earth, because I was like, you know, that's the real sacrifice. When someone says, it wasn't for me that I did what I had to do, it was so that I could have the pleasure of watching you do what you need to do in life. And that's why I love my grandfather. So then there's this bear called sugarcane. Food is a really big, important part of how we relate, ladies and gentlemen, to the world and historical processes. You know, a long time ago, there was this guy in the woods of New Guinea, and he was hunting, and he was really thirsty. And he decided to break open this reed and drink from it. And the reed tasted really, really good. In fact, it tasted sweet. Then eventually, his wife and her friends began to grow it. And that reed spreads from prehistoric New Guinea across Southeast Asia into India, into Iran, into Iraq. It gets to the Mediterranean. And then at some point around 1500, a Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas decides that it's probably better to get Africans to grow this reed. It's called sugarcane, and it gets way taller than that. And it's cut with machetes, and it's, again, back to the snakes and the other poisonous things, and the drudgery and the heat. And that was the same plantation, by the way, they filmed Django on. They still grow sugarcane right in the shadow of the slave cabins that are standing there. And so you begin to understand that a long time ago, some guy was really thirsty, led to a trickle that became a flood that ended up resulting in the fact that everybody in this room of African descent, whether you know it or not, got here because of this one plant and because of our insatiable need for sweetness. So it's moments like that in food history that really make you think about reality. And not everybody worked in the field. Some people were craftsmen, like my friend Jerome, who is taught himself how to do wood carving and other crafts. Some people were cooks. And I taught myself a lot of this by trial and error and by studying people who already knew how to do historic cooking. And I decided that I was going to put on the clothing of an enslaved person. I was going to perform the cooking, the crafts, the foodways. I was going to learn the whole process. And I was going to make mistakes on the way and burn all the hair off my arms and lose a couple of eyebrows. And it was going to be a great thing. And I didn't realize what a revolutionary act it is to put on the clothes of an enslaved person and go around the South. Because when you go to the South has three things left. There's no more cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, rice are dwindling by the year because those things can be grown just as easily in Brazil, in China. There's no more textile industry. Coal is dying. I don't care what the clean coal people tell you, it's dying. The South ain't got nothing left but music, food, and history. Who made the music? Who cooked the food? And who built those antebellum mansions? Hello. You get my point. So when you go to these antebellum mansions, what do you see? You see a 50-year-old man running around pretending to be a 17-year-old Civil War soldier and a college debutante running around in a hoop skirt talking about the good old days. And then you have me, the counterbalance to that argument. And it is not pleasant for a lot of white Southerners to face that reality. But I have found that many have actually been much more amenable to the discussion when you cloak it in terms of food. And at first, I was really kind of like annoyed with all the mammy stories I heard. I ain't making this up. I had a lot of older gentlemen talk all lovingly about their mammy from back in the day. And then I took off my get upset about everything hat and put on my research hat and started writing things down because they all were only telling me what they knew from their worldview. And they were telling me precious details about people who had names and families and stories. And I actually used those stories to interview more people and do research. But it is not easy. Everybody who does living history in the African American community wants to do like the 54th Massachusetts. We want to be the people in glory, people who were shooting people. We don't want to be the people who were whipped, right? But for me, impersonating or bringing to life these cooks, either first person or third person, is really powerful because these were powerful people. You did not mess with the cook. The cook was the last one to get sold. This is a $2,100 enslaved person. Do the math. $2,100 in 19th century money versus what it would be today. I am the gold Lexus of human beings. Understand me. And you don't want to piss me off because I will poison you, put ground glass in your food, or otherwise make your life a dyspeptic hell. That is what it meant to be a black cook. You had immense power. You should see the records of black people who were cooks being sold in family units because you couldn't this is the one family you couldn't break up. And if that did happen, it was because of other things going on in the big house community that are a little bit more difficult to talk about. But the bottom line was these were powerful people who exerted an immense amount of influence over the emotional, personal, and mental lives of the people they shared the household with. And that's something we don't get taught about in school. Or that these people who got their freedom, either by their own means or by emancipation, they went on to be restaurateurs, tavern owners, and caterers in the biggest and best cities in America. And long before there was a single Italian, Mexican, or Chinese restaurant, it was black people running the show. The best cook in early America, the best chef in early America was James Hemings. James Hemings was enslaved to Thomas Jefferson. James Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's wife's half-brother and his mistress's brother. James Hemings learned to cook at 19 at the court of Versailles in Paris. Do you understand me? No cook, no chef in early America had better training, more refined training than James Hemings. He got his freedom because he taught his brothers and relatives how to cook in the French style. He got his papers. He was literate, he was multilingual, and he was brilliant. And you don't hear about that. We are the beginning of American gourmet cuisine. We are not the end. So you go through a cook's day, and you have to get the fire started. And that takes a lot of time. And you got to remember, they were up in the morning like at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning after going to bed at 11 o'clock at night the night previous. And they have to be the first ones up to get the breakfast started, to make the coffee, to make the tea, which, by the way, is not put in a Keurig machine. We talking about grinding it and roasting it and grinding it and pouring it and refining it through a sieve. It's just ridiculous. This is not what, there's nothing instant about it. This is, look at that, wood. Wood and fire and smoke in your lungs and your nose, burning you every single day. And then the first thing you do is you make the bread in the morning, and after that comes the dishes. And if you're dealing with a wealthy household, a wealthy plantation, you're talking about being responsible for preparing 5 to 12 courses, which is serious business. We're not talking about a meat and 3, okay? We're talking about serious stuff, and pastries, and breads, and everything, and doing the baking. And typically you can work with your family or a staff of people, but it was backbreaking work. Some days, the more I do this, the harder it gets. Nothing doesn't get easier. Lifting 60-pound, cast iron pots with hot water in them. And I remember one time I was at a site in Virginia, and I was cooking, and this group of people decided to laugh at me because I stumbled with this pot of hot water, like it was funny, like I was bumbling. And I had been on my feet for like 8 hours, and it was getting dark, and I was really cold, and I was really upset. And I was there to teach them. I wasn't there to be laughed at. I was a human being. And I really had to stop myself from having a very unprofessional moment. There's another word for that for those of you who watch the Boondocks. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I ain't going to elaborate. You can tell the rest of the people in the room later. And you know which word to whisper. But I think that got me. That's when I really felt it. Like, I felt that sort of just, you have no idea. If you were at Auschwitz, would you laugh? Would you think it was so damn funny? Well, why do you think it's funny here for me to stumble when all I'm trying to do is teach you and honor my ancestors? And I almost hurt myself. And I really had to decompress from that moment. I was so angry I never went back to that site. I just couldn't. You talk about being angry or being bitter or just processing that energy, it was hard. And so there are moments where this job is not so noble, it is not so fun. It is really reliving certain ancestral memories I would rather keep buried. And so the food looks great. The food comes out. The food is cooked. The kush and the sweet potatoes and the black-eyed peas and the hop and john, the jambalaya and the gumbo and the okra soup and the fried chicken and the barbecue and all these wonderful things, the kala, all those wonderful things that Africans in the Americas contributed. And then you remember the whole rest of the process. The massa and missus tell you what you're going to eat, what you're going to cook that day. And that gun is there for a reason. And that, in that kitchen, in that space with the women cooking, with the men cooking, is a little bit of freedom in how you get to talk about the world and have a little bit of enjoyment in a life of enslavement and bitterness. And the table has to be set a certain way. And you meekly enter that dining room with your head bowed. And you present the food. And if it's not to their liking, you're punished. See, we did these pictures this way because I want you to understand slavery is not a woodcut in a textbook. Slavery is not a watercolor. Slavery was just as real as the world that you imagine around yourselves today. It was just as real, just as live and in color, and just as uncomfortable as you might think it was. And so we make these images so that you can understand as close as possible what that might have been like. And then there's the punka. Can you guess what that was for? That was the air conditioning system. If you can see it in the picture, which I doubt you can, there's a chair by the fireplace. I'm looking up at this punka. This is the largest punka in the South. So you go to these museums, these plantation museums, and they will tell you, look at our glorious punka, our glorious windows, our wonderful wallpaper. A story that I'm known for telling is how I went to one of the plantations that Robert E. Lee grew up on, and how the docent was going on and on about the love notes that his parents scratched with their diamond rings into the windows. you know, so-and-so loves so-and-so. But when we got to the slavery part, she didn't want to say anything. And then they got to the crib of Robert E. Lee, and they started praying over it. By the way, I was with the Daughters of the Confederacy on my tour, which is a great place to be for a black Jew. So yeah, they started praying over the crib, and it was wonderful. It was such a great moment in my life. I had to run so fast. I had another one of those unprofessional moments coming on, so I had to run. But that punka is all you need to know about power. A little kid, a little boy or girl, would sit in that chair and fan the white people as they ate dinner. They had to pull that heavy pulley. Sometimes it would be in a swing above the table, and if they fell asleep, they were whipped. Or they had to be careful so the peacock feathers didn't go into the gravy. Or other times they had to actually carry like a paper fan, like Booker T. Washington did, and fan the people at the table. And so I felt a real energy around that chair and that area. You go to these places, it's not easy. Where you feel a strong sense of pain. And I'm marveling at this thing that was carved from mahogany, and I'm thinking to myself, but at what cost do we observe this beauty? So, yeah, this whole process from fire to plate to table, we glory in from, earth to table, don't we? We forget how hard it used to be. And so I didn't know anything about, where the food came from. So I had to relearn all of that. Learn about Ossabaw hogs and cotton patch geese and Dominica hens and all these animals and meats and proteins and wild animals and wild fruit and all these other elements of people's lives that were endemic and unique to the worlds of African Americans who also had regional differences. There were black enslaved people in New England. There were black people who were in New York. There were black people who were enslaved in Philadelphia, who were enslaved in Maryland, Virginia, and the Chesapeake region, and down into North Carolina, in the Tidewater, and the Piedmont, down in South Carolina and Georgia, in the Low Country, into tropical Florida, across the Gulf Coast to New Orleans, up the lower Mississippi Valley, in the southern hinterland in Appalachia. And they were all living similar but dissimilar lives with different species and different types of plants and animals. They were amateur botanists and amateur zoologists, and all of this has been forgotten. And as far as African Americans are concerned, for a lot of us, unfortunately, there's no connection with nature anymore. Even though nature itself, the forces of nature, was the heart of our spirituality. It was the heart of our religion, which, by the way, was compromised along with our names and our identities in slavery. But the fact of the matter is that knowledge is what built the southern landscape, built the southern culture, combined with, of course, the knowledge from Europe and Native America and other places. But the bottom line is we synthesized it. And so I felt it was important to know the heirloom crops and heritage breed animals and wild foods of our ancestors, that wasn't the same. What we consider soul food wasn't the same as what they ate. Soul food is the memory cuisine of the great-grandchildren of enslaved people. Soul food is not what enslaved people ate. Don't get it twisted. They're not the same, it's not the same deal. In some ways, our enslaved ancestors ate better than we do. In other ways, surely not. And so all these truths only come out when you're out in the middle of your garden and it's a full moon and you're gardening by the full moon because that's what they did. You really have to put yourselves in their shoes, and very few people want to. And I guess that's the point. So, just finding these different seeds is part of the process. So the barbecue thing today, I felt I should throw this in here. Since you all had Dave's beautiful North Carolina grilling machine pork from your pigs here at the farm, I want to give you a quick tour of how this is done when I'm in my interpreter's clothes. So you dig a big hole and you make a really big fire, hopefully with oak, apple, hickory, some kind of deciduous hardwood, and you take living trees and you cut them down, tulip poplar, oak, hickory, saplings, whatever. They have to be a certain thickness so the meat doesn't fall through. And you cut them down less than 18 hours before you're ready to cook. And in the meanwhile, you let them soak. Then After that big fire has cooked down to nothing but coals, you put the meat on over top of the saplings. And if you want to let the meat smoke, you add green wood. The saplings themselves add nothing to the process, by the way. That's the question I get asked the most. They still have the bark on. They don't add anything to the flavor or the food. They're just the grill work. And this was a system of barbecue brought from West Africa. By the way, there's a lot of controversy over where the name barbecue originated, but if you look in the Hausa language of northern Nigeria, unfortunately where Boko Haram lives now, the word barbecue is actually pretty endemic to the indigenous languages there. The word is babake, which means to grill, to toast, to build an enormous fire. We had that word long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So where do these things come from? What are their origins? So you can see the meat cooks over the fire for 6 to 8 hours, like you'd expect, turning it constantly and mopping it and flavoring it, and then eventually it's taken off and chopped. This is a Colonial Williamsburg, by the way. They had never done this before. They had never done the original barbecue till my crazy self brought it there. And we did it, people loved it. People were so excited. It gets chopped up and eaten. Now, we do all that meat talking, so I want to quickly go back to West Africa for a very important reason. Part of what African Americans today are doing to reclaim our diet and our food ways is to think about the ways our ancestors ate, because I want to make something very clear to you. Our ancestors were vegivores. They were not big meat eaters, only because it wasn't possible. Environmental factors like the tsetse fly, other things, prevented them from having a lot of protein in their diet for domesticated animals or poultry. Poultry were more important as, vermin killers than they were as meat. And goats were more important for fertilizer than they were as meat. And every now and then you get, a treat of extra protein, and was almost always connected to a religious event. So if you think about African American typical Sunday dinner with the roast chicken or fried chicken, you can think about that in that same light. That was a special holy, event where you could have that extra protein. But essentially it was legumes, it was peanuts, it was tomatoes, things from the New World that had just arrived that were conversant with African cultigens that were alike. So we didn't adopt anything that was especially exotic. It was all things that had their cognates, botanical cognates in West Africa. So one of the things that I've done is go through this long list of wild and cultivated foods and identified botanical species that were cognate on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's amazing. Even pokeweed, which is, native to North America, has its cognate in West Africa, the same family, Phytolacca. So they're all there. And they only ate and adopted things that were alike to what they had. So when you come here to the Americas and you see things that are similar in South America or the southeastern United States, they were making decisions based upon memory. And that's very important, that someone in this long trip on the slave ship will remember these things and take them, incorporate them, and pass them down to their children. But you see what's there. There's fish, dried fish, there's fruit, there's greens, there's palm oil, all that kind of good stuff. And we lost a lot of that. But we transformed what we had into a semblance of African cooking. So that's at Jamestown. That was in honor of Anthony Johnson, who arrived from Angola to Jamestown, so cooked all Angolan food. And look at the technology. You're using the mortar and pestle, which survived slavery. You are using these one pots. You're using hot stones, griddles. All of that stayed. And then you come to America from West Africa, Central Africa, and you get to put up with this. Now, all you had back when was a pot and 3 stones, a couple of wooden and metal instruments, and then you graduate to this. How do you make, a connection between their world and your world? And in this process, I learned something else. I'm understanding through food how my ancestors became Americans. And that's a big question for every American ethnic group. How did my people become Americans? How did they lose old identities and adopt new identities? And food is a very clear way of seeing that journey. So here you see in Louisiana, they have the Afro-Creole flag. France, Spain, Senegal, and Mali, all in one flag. So they're owning the fact that they are indeed a product of Europe and Africa in Louisiana. And again, the same plantation they filmed Django at. These are the original slave cabins, guys. There's 20 of them standing, and we're 22. 2 were destroyed by a hurricane. I walked in them. This is at twilight. You want to know about eerie? Go to a Louisiana plantation at twilight and walk through some slave cabins that haven't been lived in half a century. It's magical, but it's also very, very sobering. So this gentleman is a 10th generation Mobilian Creole. 10 generations. 1720s and 30s, his ancestors arrived from Africa and Europe. And the same town in Mobile, Alabama, was the last place that a black man and woman stepped off a slave ship in 1860. And their descendants still live there too. Think about that. Ms. Leah Chase is still here with us. Interviewing these elders is a big part of my work. Interviewing them because they're the ones who are the people who own this. And let's think about this. Ms. Leah is 91, 92 years old, still goes to work every day, 9, 10 hours a day, and is one of the sweetest people you ever meet. Although she did tell me when we took this picture, I have only one request. And I said, Ms. Leah, anything for you. And she says, you have to make me look like Halle Berry. I did my best. By the way, remember The Princess and the Frog? A young Leah Chase was the model for the princess. Yeah, that's her. That's kind of like a fantasy take off of her personal story. Yep. Miss Mildred Covert, author of the Kosher Creole Cookbook, the Kosher Cajun Cookbook, and the Kosher Confederate Cookbook. She told me flat out, when you come to New Orleans, you will be meeting with me. I'm like, all right, Miss Covert. She said to me, she took me to this synagogue on Dryad Street. She said, do you know who taught us to cook on Dryad Street? Black women. She said it point blank. She said, there is no such thing as Southern Jewish cooking without African Americans. And she took me to the synagogue because that was the synagogue she grew up in. It went from being an Orthodox synagogue to being a Baptist church. And after Katrina, when she lost her home, along with many other people, she went back there, took me back there just to thank the black pastor who runs the church now. Because she said his sermon gave her hope and lifted her out of depression. So it was a really special moment. She was in tears. But she taught me all about like her growing up. She's in her 90s. And she is the real driving Miss Daisy. Don't get it twisted. She is no joke. And she, told me things about her mother. I think she was the first one born in America. Her mother immigrated from Europe, straight from Europe to New Orleans, got off the boat and tried to eat a banana whole because she'd never seen one before. So she told me memories of people coming from Eastern Europe that like nobody has anymore. Nobody knows this stuff. And so it was a real blessing to sit down with her and learn from her. And so at the Black History Museum in Donaldsonville, I learned something really important. So in 1912, 100 years before this picture was taken, there were black wealthy businessmen who decided that the sharecroppers were starving, they were suffering. If you were a sharecropper, by the way, you had to go into debt to feed yourself. They don't tell you that part. And so they grew vegetables, they grew produce for the people working in the sugarcane fields. Okay? So the people working in the sugarcane fields were sharecroppers who were poor, who were starving, who were malnourished. And in 1912, these farmers got together and decided, we're going to work cooperatively, we're going to take turns working these produce gardens, and whatever a poor sharecropper wants to have, more food on their table, they can just come here, get the food, and go home in peace. So you mean to tell me in 1912 we figured this shit out, in 2012 we didn't? It blew my mind when my sister told me, who runs the museum, told me this, and showed me, no, we had this under control 100 years ago. What happened in 100 years to make us go from a people who took charge and took care of ourselves to a people who live in food deserts and accepted that as a reality. And I'm not talking about bootstraps. Don't get me wrong. No, it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the simple fact that, again, if Black Lives Matter, you got to act like it. When you see people hanging from trees and people needing the strength and nourishment to go up north, have other opportunities, you do what you have to do to make that happen. And the shadow of Oak Alley and these other gorgeous plantations is this memory that Black people did everything they could, despite the system of Jim Crow, to provide for themselves, and then food was a priority, not a secondary, tertiary concern, along with voting and other means of survival. So that blew my mind. Like, I'm sitting here trying to think of some solution to food deserts, and my ancestors had already solved it. So when I see my friend Denzel Mitchell in Baltimore taking over empty lots and turning them into inner city farms, he's not reinventing the wheel. He is following in tradition. And that's what we need to do in every community. So in Mississippi, this is what we learned. This was the food picture from Natchez, Mississippi, from Melrose Plantation. It was called, by one white participant, the largest integrated gathering she'd ever seen in Natchez, Mississippi. People who had the same name, last name, who had never talked, who didn't go to the same church, who didn't work the same job, who were neighbors by a couple of minutes or miles, Black and white, who didn't know each other. And they are on the grounds of Melrose Plantation. I'm talking about the marble columns, the Spanish moss, the whole deal. And they're picking cowpeas together and shucking corn and making peach cobbler and laughing and talking on a multi-generational level. And guess who showed up that day? James Meredith. James Meredith, young folks, is the man who integrated the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. You want to talk about somebody feeling humble that day? Who am I to have James Meredith show up in my presentation? When he dodged bullets, got shot, got beaten, got rejected by the governor of Mississippi. Well, yet he showed up and said, hey, I'm here to support you. That's another elder moment that made me very emotional. But even more so to have these people say, we don't know each other. And this gave us an opportunity to know each other. I want to reclaim these plantations and places of cultural memory as places where we can reconcile with each other and heal. We Southerners are a dysfunctional family, but we are still a family. And if there's anybody who is more related to each other and knows each other, it is us. It's to the point where if I asked a white Southerner, I said, well, what's your family name? And they'll say, oh, we're probably related. 50 years ago, they'd never say that. And now it's a thing. We know we're cousins. We know we're related to each other. We know we have the same names, the same struggles, the same family, the same blood, the same bone. We may not have the same brains or perceptions of things, but at least we know this. We are kin to each other. And that's something I learned in this event. 101-year-old man, I just got to show him because he said that the best thing he ever did in his life was vote in 2008. And that's when he smiled. He's a very clear-minded man, and he was a gem to interview. And we got to meet more people like that. And then in the South, you see things like this. You know who that's supposed to be? Mammy. And they lighten her up, which is supposed to be a good thing. Because for some time, Mammy's kitchen had bright red lipstick, I ain't making this up, and was very ebony. She was a caricature. She wasn't an authentic perception of a beautiful black woman. She was a caricature of what they thought Mammy should be. And so people told me, you should go eat at Mammy's kitchen. And I said, hell no. And so this very authentic look on my face, that's not staged. That was I promise you, that was like an impromptu picture to show me how I looked when I was mad, turning my back on Mammy's kitchen. But you want to know the most misogynist, evil thing about this picture? You enter the restaurant through her skirt. Y'all think about that for a second. For real, Mammy's kitchen. And you go to these places in the South, these plantation museums, And you see the Jolly Negro Bank, where you put a penny in his hand, and he eats it, and his eyes roll back in his head. And you see these other, this is not black memorabilia. I have no problem with black memorabilia. A lot of us collect that because it's part of our history. That's not, no, these are welcome to the South, take away a souvenir kind of things. And it's deep. And so I take pictures of them. Sometimes I really wanted to buy them and show them when I do a presentation. Then I said, I'm not giving these people my money. I'll take a picture, it'll last longer. You know, but yeah, I'll show you Mammy's Kitchen in Mississippi. Can't miss her. See her for miles around. And then there's things like this. The African experience in America. This is a man's yard in Birmingham, an artist. And it goes on for acres and acres. It's like a couple acres. And it's what they call in the South yard art. Now, you in the North may call this a junkyard. We call this art. But there's something incredibly beautiful about it, because he took all the pollution and junk in his neighborhood and turned it into a history lesson for the black kids and white kids of Birmingham. A spiritual lesson. So you can see some of the things like that map of Africa and some other things he says, that's full of words and poetry. And if you're a art historian or know about the aesthetics of the African diaspora, this is one of the richest spaces you'll ever see in the South. Circles and wheels and crossroads and paths and fish and other symbols, ancient symbols that go back and reverberate through African art through to this man's vision of the future. And you see things like this and you know that you're home. So what's the future like? So we can get to some questions. What's the future like? It's about teaching people about this history. It's about showing them that what we have in common. And it's about creating a sense of community across boundaries. I am black and I'm Jewish, and I go around teaching about kosher soul food, or at least my interpretation of it. And so this idea of being family to people is really important to me. At the synagogue in Birmingham, I met a woman who lost her partner to breast cancer. And the woman converted to Judaism, and her partner's mother, who's also deceased, kind of taught her how to cook all these Jewish recipes. She was very much like, you know, pardon the expression, redneck Southern. She became part of this Jewish family. And now she's the only person in the family that knows all these recipes going back to like Ukraine and Poland. But she was the one who preserved it. And then I met these two ladies who came over to Alabama after World War II. They're sisters. They're the only two people in their family who survived the Holocaust. And you want to know something really special? When you have two sisters who survived the Holocaust, tell you, when you told them, this is my first time in Birmingham, the city that my grandparents, maternal grandparents were from, and they left here because this was their Poland. They had to run away. They couldn't come back here. It was too dangerous. It was too scary. And the two women said, well, after Europe, they didn't say the Holocaust, they said after Europe, we came here, after Germany, and we saw how bad it was, and we fought for civil rights. And we're glad we did, so that you could come back home to Alabama. Not I suffered, not, you know, I don't have my mother and father anymore, not we're all we have in the world and our families were created here in America. No, we're glad we did what we did so that you could come back home to your home. You could be reunited with your ancestors, with your past. Do you want to know how special that feels to hear that? You know, that was a moment that really changed my life, because I understood, as my friend Rabbi Mena told me, the journey that you put yourself on is going to change your path, your existence forever. And she was right. So there are blessings and paths in the world. So it's, you know, to relate to white Southerners in a whole new way, without antagonism, but in the spirit of commonality, that we share a culture, and reminding them that the culture we share is partly based on what my forefathers and foremothers brought. And when we come to the same table and eat on common terms, then we begin to understand each other and make peace and reconciliation. But it's not just about interracial or interethnic harmony, it's about what we do for ourselves. You know, teaching kids in Atlanta and other places how to plant the heirloom seeds their ancestors brought to this country on slave ships. Teaching those kids about how to eat from the ground up. It's talking to our communities and saying that we have an obligation to save and rescue historic spaces related to the history of slavery reconstruction and black uplift. It's talking to this gentleman here in Montgomery, Alabama, who is doing a community farm right by the railroad tracks. He has to basically grow everything above ground because there's so much pollution and other unsavory things in the soil. And so what he's doing is growing it on the space where they used to sell the slaves in Montgomery. And he's teaching these kids the history as well as showing them we're selling this stuff to restaurants. We're, you know, creating a partnership. Culinary justice is what happens when the kids grow the heirloom produce, the heritage produce. They eat it, they enjoy it, they share it with others. They know how to market it, sell it, grow it organically. And then the chefs that buy it from them have an organic relationship with the black community instead of just taking the ideas and the history and using that to market themselves. There's a relationship there. People are giving back. It's not just a one-way street. There's reciprocity all through the whole process. That's what culinary justice looks like. Or it looks like at that other site where we have African-American chefs demonstrate for black kids that you can be a black chef. That is not beneath you. That it's a great way to earn a living, a great way to make people happy, great way to make people healthy. When those kids at the site in Atlanta, this project, which I'll be happy to put a list of all these things on the internet later, those kids love to see these chefs cook. They help them cook. They peel the produce. They help them in the cooking process. They grow the food there at the site. And they're learning really awesome things. This is in southwest Atlanta, an impoverished part of southwest Atlanta. But it's a multicultural farmers market where you have everybody coming there. You have, you know, people from, this lady's from Jamaica. She makes all these healthy, you know, wonderful like drinks from like hibiscus and other stuff. And this beautiful lady is a vegan caterer. And it was the first place I ever saw a dollar stay in the hands of black people, which is a miracle in and of itself. So we have an African-American, farmer, the guy in the purple who's looking incredulously at the moment. Well, he's an awesome guy. He's like, his farm is in Montezuma, Georgia, and his family's been on that land for 120 years. And he grew all that produce with his family. He held on to his land. He didn't give it up. He didn't let anybody take it from him and sell it. You know, it's hard for black people to keep land because those taxes and what they switch things on us a lot. It's hard for us to keep track of the land our ancestors gave us. It's not always our fault. But he's held on to it. And so he sold his produce to my friend, the vegan caterer, and I bought food from her at an event for the Habesha organization in Atlanta, which teaches African-American teenagers how to do organic farming, rain farming, etc., and sends them for 2 weeks to Africa, Ethiopia and Ghana for a week each. And then those kids come back after their journey is over, and they teach the next group. But it was the first time I saw a dollar bill stay in my community. And the power of that, and the fact of the matter is, there was nothing unsavory. It was all wholesome, the whole process. That everything about it was positive, uplifting, and spiritually important. I also saw the entire Atlanta black community of all different political and religious shapes and types come together to support this effort. And I saw their farm in the inner city of Atlanta and went, this is spectacular. But why aren't we hearing about this? Why aren't we noting that this is what's going on? And it's not just Atlanta, it's Philadelphia, it's Baltimore, it's New Orleans, it's LA with Ron Finley doing the guerrilla gardening in South Central. We need to recognize the fact that our black activists all over this country, not Michael Twitty, people who are in that dirt every single day, trying to make lives better for everybody else, using what they have the same way their ancestors did. So, there are raw vegan black chefs there are also black gay Jewish chefs. And we do more than just soul food. We do every food. We do sushi superbly. We do everything. And we're unapologetic about it. And the world needs to know that we exist so that we can more fully participate in the food culture of not just this country, but the entire planet. I recognize also, my friend Beth in Virginia, the fact that we have a connection to Native American people. And the First Nations people gave us a lot of the food that we eat. And there is a brotherhood and sisterhood between the work that I'm doing and the work that indigenous chefs are doing, where by going back to some of what our ancestors gave us, our traditions, we are in fact not only saving them from amnesia. You know, part of my work is about talking to Asian, Native American, Latino communities in the South, white ethnic communities in the South who are often forgotten, about how we have a common bond as Southern people and how we have a common future. As Martin Luther King used to say, we will either, you know, perish as fools or survive as brothers. And I'd rather do the surviving than the perishing. At this point, I'm just going to be quiet and let you ask me questions, or talk and let you ask me questions and all that kind of good stuff. I hope that you've learned something. I hope that and I thank you very much.
Michael, and as some of you may know, we've been able to actually live stream this, and so we also have graduate students and other folks who couldn't make it here with us, and so actually, if you don't mind, Michael, we have the first question.
Sure.
So from one of the folks out there who wants to know if you feel that a culinary professional, do you feel that as a culinary professional, there can ever be a truly defined American cuisine with America's history and diverse ancestry?
Absolutely. The answer to that is that there are things that happen here that happen nowhere else. And it will always be the case. One of the best places to see that is New York or Houston. The fact that we have, the word fusion is really bad. I've been discouraged from using the word fusion because it suggests kind of a sloppy sort of, you know, collision of culinary traditions. I prefer other terminology. It's emerging, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue. You know, my kosher soul rolls are a dialogue between being black and being Jewish. There's pastrami in them, there's collard greens in them, it's a dialogue. It's not the same as a fusion food. And I think that there are foods that are brought to America from different parts of the world in specific contexts. You know, for example, there's Hmong rice. What's the history behind that? It's the rice that Hmong people brought when they're escaping Vietnam, Laos, after the Vietnam War, who were our allies in that conflict. And then there's Carolina gold rice. We talked about that history. And so I think the most important thing is for Americans to be more aware of the intertwining histories and not talk in ways like, oh, we have sorghum. No, we don't just have sorghum. There's a history behind that. No, we don't just have this. There's history behind it. Don't take the bounty and the unity of the American table for granted. And that's how it should work. Yeah.
how when we lose touch with our ancestral heritage, with that DNA, when we lose touch with our sense of place, how we're susceptible, we're vulnerable to having a wool pulled over our eyes, to being taken advantage of, and to being complacent and ignorant of the fact. So I'd like to hear a little bit of your thoughts on that, but then also you just very briefly threw in more Native American stuff again, which I'd like to hear more about, because all over this country and all over the world, we have not been honoring the indigenous people enough.
Right.
Here in Vermont, which is a very liberal state, the Abenaki only
Right.
recently got their state recognition and still are fighting for national recognition. And you talked a little bit about lobster, and we have what's going on in Peru with quinoa,
Right.
where people are just, they can't, what you said about how when you're oppressed, how you survive is you're on the capital, or capital is being,
And they don't even have that anymore.
they don't have it anymore. So I'd like to hear more about how we can get back in touch with our ancestral heritage, while at the same time honoring the ancestors of the place we are.
So I want to address the second part first. Despite what some people are saying, African Americans, among all non-Native American ethnic groups, have the most Native American blood connections. And even when there's not blood, I'd like to say this. There's a thing called kinship. Native American groups, kinship doesn't work the same way. Kinship can be a non-blood thing. That's very important. So Native Americans and Africans had a very complicated relationship on the eastern seaboard and in the south. There was slavery, there was war, there was unity and cooperation, there was friendship. All those things happened simultaneously. As far as Africans and Native Americans are concerned on the dietary level, corn, of course, becomes the staple of the Southern diet. Without Native Americans, there's no corn, there's no hominy, there's no hoe cake, there's no hush puppy, there's none of that. There's no breading for like what we fry our food in the Southern diet. Now, among other things, what's very interesting to me is that when Africans become part of Native American communities, their foods do as well. So you begin to see cowpeas, sweet potatoes, watermelon, rice in southeastern Native American communities. And these were foods that the British and Americans couldn't burn. You get me? So they were all like in these maroon communities, these runaway communities, the communities of freedom seekers who were trying to survive. That's why the Seminole, to this day, exist in parts of Florida, because they had adopted this system of small, instead of the big fields, small tropical gardening that was more West African than it was indigenous, mixing Native American and African crops. The same way in Brazil that Africans and Native Americans lived in maroon communities in the Amazon for centuries. For centuries. And so for me, acknowledging the Native American contribution is not just acknowledging the contribution from the past, but acknowledging that Lumbee and Cherokee and Creek and Choctaw communities, Seminole communities, and then some, Powhatan, Nanticoke, all over, and of course Abenaki, Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, all those communities across the Northeast as well have a connection to black people and black history, or just they're living people. They're people who have not died off. They're not extinct. And talking about Native American and Native American culture as if it is an extinct thing, as opposed to a living, breathing thing, is damning. It's horrific. So I'm all about talking to Native American scholars and experts and saying, there's a connection between us. We need to talk about it, because I want people to know that you're still here. You haven't gone anywhere, and you're still a part of us. And that revolutionary spirit that we had in the Seminole Wars, that revolutionary spirit we had when we first arrived in this country in 1526, the first non-Native American permanent settlement was Africans escaping to live in Native American communities and run away from the Spanish in South Carolina, long before there was a St. Augustine, long before there was a Jamestown. So that spirit of African Native American coalition building and connection is at the root of what it means to be a real American. On the other side, I think that you do lose an incredible amount of your soul when you lose your tradition and your past and your culture. When you forget about that blood memory, when you try to force it away and try to destroy it. You know, there's a beautiful film called The Language I Cry In, and it's based on a Mende proverb. Again, I'm proud to say I'm a Mende descendant, that says, you can only believe somebody when they talk to you in the language they cry in. And it's based on the fact that Lorenzo Dalter, an African-American anthropologist in the 1930s, recorded a woman singing a song that she would sing to her children and didn't know the meaning of. And he traced it back to the Mende people of Sierra Leone. And then a white anthropologist named Joe Opala decided to pick the story up. He went and found the descendants of this woman, and they were still singing the song in the 1980s and 1990s. And so they were teaching it, I don't know if the lady's still alive, but she was teaching it to her granddaughter and great-granddaughter, and eventually he got them back to Sierra Leone. And we went back to the one village where this song is still being sung. And when the woman who, in the village, who still sang this, and it was a mourning song, it was a song that the women sing when they're accompanying the body to the grave. When the woman from Sierra Leone met the elder from Georgia and heard her sing this, she burst into almost inconsolable tears. And she said to her, I never thought that my mother would come back through you. So I want to say this. In our community, we have this long-standing debate and dialogue and argument over the place of African people. Jamaican versus African American. Nigerian versus, Harlemite. Guyanese versus Trinidadian. Let me tell you something. In my journey, when I tell people I'm Ghanaian heritage, Ghana people from Ghana be like, that's right, we claiming you. When I told people from Sierra Leone, have answered Sierra Leone, they didn't say, oh, that's great, Black American, whatever. They're like, you're a Sierra Leonean. You're one of us. You're our family. And we welcome you back home. Anytime, you're one of us. And when African Americans could also have their DNA tested, people who had never disclosed to me, they would say, oh, I'm from Sierra Leone too. I'm part Ghanaian too. It's a beautiful feeling when people say to you, you're one of us. You're ours. And so all of that nonsense about disconnect and how people argue and black versus black become totally irrelevant the minute someone says, I love you, you are my brother, you're my sister. And I've been fortunate in this whole journey where everybody's been like, no, you one of us. Even if you wasn't one of us, I'd still claim you. And that's really beautiful. And that means a lot. But you have to be willing and able to respond to those memories in your head, in your bone, in your body, and follow them where they lead you. I hope I answered your question. Ashe. Ashe.
One or two more questions?
Oh, I am, okay. Because I saw him pointing to someone else. Yeah, okay. I was just, I have two questions. One is, where do you think respect,
I got you.
Okay, meaning and study of a different culture ends and cultural appropriation begins. Mm-hmm. And do you think it's also important for people who are from ethnicities that don't have a history of oppression to try to find their own cultural identity as well?
Absolutely. There was a gentleman in not Dickinson College, but I forget the other college in Pennsylvania, who came up to me and said, I read your blog, I'm Italian American, I finally got the money together to go back to Italy, and you inspired me to go back to the villages where my grandparents were from. and I want to learn about the cooking. I want to learn about them through the cooking. And that just made me ecstatic. I was like, wow. Because at the end of the day, most cultures have some level of a story of oppression, of subjugation, or enslavement. Almost nobody's immune from that. But even if you don't, you know, is there a value in someone from the upper Midwest going back to Scandinavia? Absolutely. Or finding their roots that way, or connecting? Absolutely. Being, you know, when people, Americans say I'm a mutt or I'm a mishmash, who cares? I don't like that. I find it to be a little bit disrespectful to your past. When you know what people went through to make that trip across the Atlantic, for having to like leave behind people and places forever. And some of them really wanted to express their identity in their past, but they never could. I think it's really important for everybody to know about their background. Even if you were 20 different things. If you're Bruno Mars, good luck. That brother's going all over the planet. And that's fantastic. That's what a real human being is. So absolutely, nobody, you don't have to be, you know, of African descent or brown or black to do this. You can be anybody and have that richness in your life. You know, one young lady said to me, well, my family is part Scandinavian, in part German, and part this, and I don't know. And I said, what does your mom make that you really like? And she said, you know, I like broccoli ramen noodle salad. And I said, fantastic. That's where you start. And I said, learning about your heritage in other ways is great, but acknowledging and giving honor to the love in your family as it is that's where it begins. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be what you have. So that's a big deal. Now, the other question is much more complicated. There's a spectrum, you know, going from appropriation is like the worst, and mockery, you know, buffoonery, minstrelry, that's the worst. And then at the other end, there's quoting and borrowing. And there's a certain level of respect there. You know when you're being disrespectful in the borrowing. I have a big issue with the current debate in American pop culture over white people and black music, because white people have been doing black music for centuries. I mean, starting with the Moors in Spain bringing the guitar. I mean, come on now. But that's silly. It's so silly to call out one or two particular people and say, you've appropriated our culture, when, no, we've branded a certain style, we've marketed it, and it's being passed around. That's not the same thing as appropriating a culture. Appropriating a culture is when you walk into a restaurant and somebody's selling the food and printing it up and, you know, upselling it based on your history and your memory and your legacy, and they even got a black busboy working in that place. I had a Swedish journalist tell me about a famous restaurant in Charleston, and he said, they talk all about this heritage food, but I don't see no black people in there. He said there was not a single black diner, a single black chef, a single black cook, a black matron, nobody. But yet all I heard about was the slaves. So there is a certain amount of uncouth in cultural appropriation. And I think some people have taken it out of perspective, and they may call out a certain pop star for wearing a kimono in an award stage during a performance. Now, whether that's in good taste or not, or whether that performer knows the implications of what they're wearing, or if someone puts on a Plains, 19th century Plains war bonnet and calls himself dressing like an Indian, it's in poor taste. It's kind of gross, if you ask me. But are they appropriating it? I don't know. But appropriation involves a certain level of exploitation and milking that those other elements don't have. So I think that a person has an obligation. I could appropriate anything, right? I could appropriate something. So it's not a one-way street. But how do I avoid appropriation? I do what I do with respect. I don't claim something that isn't mine. I don't say that something belongs to one thing when it doesn't. I don't sell that based on saying, I did this. You know, for African Americans, our dialogue about appropriation is really authentic because a lot of our inventions were claimed by our slaveholders or by white people because that was the law. So we have a history of this that makes us very uncomfortable. But at the same point in time, we need to understand that when you own your culture and when you own your history and when you're a steward of it, you don't have to worry about appropriation because nobody can do you but you. You know, so that's what it comes down to. If we owned our culture more, we owned everything about ourselves more as a people, then it would be much easier for us to deal with this. Because then we could easily say, oh, no. There is a standard. There's a level of respect. There's a level of quality. There's a level of understanding and history and meaning. And until you have scaled that wall, you are not authentic according to our book. You're not valid according to our book. But instead, we run away. We run away from so much of it and then wonder when somebody comes and picks it up. I'll talk quick. Soul food thing, right? Black chefs try to prove themselves by not doing soul food. I'm going to do French food because all people expect me to do is soul food. It was valid at the time. It's like a lot of Asian chefs tell me, oh, people expect me to do Chinese food or Thai food or Vietnamese food, but I can do anything. And I was trained in French cuisine. Okay, cool. But a lot of people backed away from those traditions. And then what happens 20 years later? Paula Deen come run up talking about I invented hoe cake. Talking about I fry chicken the best. Talking about taste my gumbo. Come on now, Paula. Y'all watch that genealogy show? They took Paula back to the plantation her great-granddaddy owns. Come on now. One of the richest men in cotton planters in Georgia. Paula Deen been taking Miss So-and-so's footnotes for the past I don't know how many years talking about she invented it. So that's dangerous. That's dangerous. Because she's a clown. She's not a clown because she's a big woman. I love big people. I'm a big person. She's not a clown because she's a smart businesswoman. Brilliant. She's a clown because she sat up there and jacked a woman like my great-great-grandmother's recipes and sold it to the world as Southern without respect for the people who taught her how to do it. And so when you own that history and don't run away from it, you can't get black folks to go to the plantation. They're scared of it. I'll tell you that right now. When we own our stuff, that's when the magic happens. And that's when we create a dialogue that we can respect each other. Leontine Price didn't appropriate opera. She just did opera. So it's all about your perspective. And when you know that you're being disrespectful, you probably are. That's the best answer I can give you, my brother. All right.